The Free Thinker Show. Ignite your mind, challenge the norm.
Ready for a deep dive into the world of weed? You've sent over a treasure trove of fascinating facts and stories, and I'm itching to unpack it all. We're talking about cannabis. From its ancient roots to those modern myths we've all heard.
What I find particularly interesting is how this collection goes beyond the usual talking points. We've got archaeological digs, bizarre news, historical anecdotes, a real 360-degree view.
Exactly. This isn't about taking sides, it's about arming you with knowledge. Think of it as your crash course in Cannabis 101. And maybe, just maybe, you'll pick up some serious trivia along the way. So first things first. Did you know that people have been cultivating cannabis for over 10,000 years? I mean, we're talking Neolithic times, folks. That's older than ancient Egypt, older than the wheel.
It really challenges our perception of early civilizations, doesn't it? To think they had this sophisticated understanding of plant cultivation and its uses. And it wasn't just about getting high, although I'm sure that was part of it. Your sources mentioned textiles, rope, even early forms of paper made from hemp.
It's like the Swiss Army knife of the plant world. And speaking of a global perspective, it's fascinating how cannabis pops up across such vast distances in ancient times. We see it in Asia, the Middle East. Did these cultures each discover these uses independently, or was there some sort of ancient cannabis trade route?
Now that's a question worth pondering. It highlights how little we truly know about the role of this plant throughout history. But one thing is certain. Attempts to restrict marijuana use are almost as old as its cultivation. Your sources mention regulations in medieval Arabia, restrictions during Napoleon's reign. Even the British Empire had its own issues with cannabis.
It seems like every generation has its own version of a war on weed, long before Nixon put it in the headlines. But here's where things get really interesting. The U.S. has had this back-and-forth relationship with hemp for centuries.
Absolutely. It's a prime example of how political agendas and economic factors can shape public perception. Take, for instance, the hemp industry's brief resurgence during World War II. Suddenly, with the need for rope and canvas for the war effort, the U.S. government was all about that hemp life.
It makes you wonder, what other potential uses for this plant have been overlooked or even demonized due to shifting political winds?
And that complexity isn't limited to hemp. It spills over into the cultural perceptions of cannabis use itself. Think about Bob Marley, a global icon laid to rest with his guitar, a soccer ball, and yes, a bud of marijuana.
Talk about a lasting statement. And speaking of lasting statements, what about the story of the rapper whose friends allegedly smoked his ashes? Now, I'm not sure if it's true or just urban legend, but it says a lot about the lengths people go to in the name of, well, remembrance.
Whether true or embellished, it underscores the powerful symbolism associated with cannabis, especially within certain communities. And perhaps no symbol is as universally recognized as 420. What started as a secret code amongst a group of high school kids searching for a mythical weed farm in the 1970s has evolved into a global phenomenon.
It makes you wonder how those teenagers would feel knowing they've essentially created an international holiday.
It's a testament to how quickly cultural practices can spread in our interconnected world. And speaking of shifting landscapes, let's not forget Washington's groundbreaking move to legalize recreational marijuana use back in 2012. Ironic considering the state's namesake and his hemp farm, wouldn't you say?
It's like a cosmic wink from George Washington himself. But on a more serious note, this shift towards legalization really opens up a whole new chapter in our relationship with cannabis, especially regarding its medicinal potential. We can't just gloss over that.
Absolutely.
Here.
One of your sources, for instance, delves into the science behind Epidiolex, an FDA-approved medication derived from cannabis, specifically used to treat certain forms of epilepsy. It's not every day you see a Schedule I substance making its way into mainstream medicine.
That's huge. It feels like we're finally starting to acknowledge that this plant, which has been demonized for so long, might actually hold the keys to treating some serious conditions. And we're not just talking about epilepsy. Research is now exploring the potential of cannabis to treat other conditions, even things like alcoholism and opioid addiction. It's fascinating, isn't it, to think we might use cannabis to combat addiction.
It's certainly a paradigm shift, but it's crucial to remember that this is still a developing area of research. While some studies show promise for cannabis in treating certain addictions, more rigorous research is needed to determine its long-term efficacy and potential risks.
So while there's hope, it's not a magic bullet. We need to approach this with cautious optimism and let the science guide us. Now, I know one of the big questions people have is, can you actually overdose on weed? We've all heard the rumors, but what does the science say?
It's a question that often sparks debate. While it's virtually impossible to fatally overdose on cannabis in the same way you might with opioids or alcohol, that doesn't mean you can't have an extremely unpleasant experience with high doses of THC, especially with edibles.
I've heard stories. Let's just say pacing yourself is key, but I'm curious. What makes a potential overdose on cannabis so different from something like alcohol?
It comes down to how these substances interact with our brains. Unlike alcohol, which can depress vital functions like breathing, cannabis doesn't act on the brainstem in the same way. Essentially, you can't consume enough cannabis to shut down those critical life-sustaining functions.
So while overdoing it with cannabis can definitely lead to a night of feeling awful, it's highly unlikely to be fatal. That being said, we still need to be mindful of the potential mental health impacts, right? Especially for individuals who might be predisposed to conditions like schizophrenia.
Absolutely. Your sources highlight studies suggesting that for individuals with a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, early and heavy cannabis use might increase the likelihood of developing the condition or experiencing more severe symptoms.
So it's not that cannabis directly causes schizophrenia, but it might act as a sort of tipping point for those already at risk.
Precisely. It underscores the importance of understanding your own mental health history and using cannabis responsibly, if at all.
Now let's get into the science a bit. Can you break down how THC and CBD actually work on our brains? I think a lot of people hear these terms but don't really grasp the science behind them.
Think of your nervous system as a vast interconnected communication network, constantly sending signals throughout your body. Now imagine THC as a substance that jumps into this network and starts amplifying certain signals, particularly those related to pleasure, sensory perception, and memory.
So it's like turning up the volume on specific channels in our brains.
That's a great way to put it. This is why people often experience heightened senses, increased laughter, or even altered perceptions of time when using cannabis with high levels of THC.
And what about CBD? Does it crank things up too, or does it work differently?
CBD is more of a subtle influencer. Instead of amplifying signals, it works by interacting with our body's endocannabinoid system, a complex network of receptors that helps regulate a wide range of functions, including mood, pain, and inflammation.
So THC is like the life of the party, and CBD is more like the designated driver making sure everyone gets home safe.
I like that analogy. While THC is often associated with the psychoactive high, CBD is gaining recognition for its potential therapeutic benefits, like reducing anxiety, alleviating pain, and even minimizing some of those less desirable side effects that can sometimes come with THC.
So depending on your desired effect, you might choose a strain with a higher CBD content if you're looking for something more calming and therapeutic, or a strain higher in THC if you're after that classic high.
Exactly. And understanding the different ways to consume cannabis is just as important as understanding its chemical makeup. You mentioned edibles earlier. What makes their effects so different from smoking?
It's always fascinated me how you can have the same amount of cannabis, but the experience is totally different depending on whether you smoke it or bake it into a brownie. Why is that?
When you smoke cannabis, the THC enters your bloodstream directly through your lungs, reaching your brain fairly quickly. Edibles, on the other hand, have to go through your entire digestive system.
So it's like the scenic route versus the express lane.
Exactly. This means the THC in edibles is metabolized by your liver before it reaches your brain, which can take anywhere from 30 minutes to a couple of hours. And here's the kicker. This metabolic process actually transforms the THC into a different form, 11-hydroxy-THC, which some believe is even more potent and longer lasting.
That explains why edible highs can be so intense and last for hours. It also explains why some folks end up having a less than enjoyable experience if they aren't patient and consume too much too quickly.
Patience is key with edibles. Start with a low dose and wait at least 2 hours before even considering having more. It's better to err on the side of caution.
Wise words. Now let's dive deeper into the medical side of things. We touched on Epidiolex earlier. But what other ailments might cannabis be a potential treatment for? The research seems to be evolving every day.
You're right, the research is definitely exploding. Chronic pain is a big one. We're seeing a growing body of evidence suggesting that cannabis, especially CBD, could offer relief for people dealing with conditions like arthritis, fibromyalgia, and even migraines.
It makes sense considering how these compounds interact with our pain receptors.
Exactly. And it's not just physical pain. Researchers are also exploring the potential of cannabis in treating mental health conditions like anxiety disorders, PTSD, and even addiction, which we touched on earlier.
It does seem a bit counterintuitive to treat addiction with something that can be addictive itself. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
It's certainly a complex issue. While THC, the psychoactive component of cannabis, can be habit-forming, CBD appears to have a different effect. Some studies suggest that CBD might help to reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms associated with other substances like nicotine, alcohol, and even opioids.
So it's like using one aspect of this plant to counter the addictive potential of another. Fascinating.
It's an intriguing avenue of research, but we're still in the early stages. It's crucial to remember that more research is needed to determine the long-term efficacy and safety of using cannabis in this way.
It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution, and we need to be cautious about making sweeping claims before the science backs it up.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of potential risks, we should mention that smoking cannabis, like smoking anything, can have negative impacts on respiratory health.
Right. Just because it's natural doesn't make it harmless.
Precisely. Cannabis smoke, even without tobacco, contains harmful substances that can irritate the lungs. Long-term heavy smoking could increase the risk of bronchitis and other respiratory issues.
So vaping or edibles might be a better option for those concerned about lung health.
It's something to consider, although it's essential to do your research and choose products from reputable sources.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good rule of thumb in general when it comes to cannabis. Do your research, know your source, and most importantly, be aware of how it affects you personally.
I couldn't agree more. Every individual reacts to cannabis differently. What works for one person might not work for another. And what's considered a pleasant experience for some could be anxiety-inducing for others.
And let's not forget about the legal landscape, which varies wildly depending on where you are in the world. What's legal in one state or country might land you in hot water in another.
It's a constantly evolving landscape, and it's crucial to stay informed about the laws in your specific area.
Now, before we wrap up, I have to ask, did Shakespeare really smoke weed?
Ah, the age-old question. Well, we can't know for sure. Some intriguing evidence suggests it's possible. Clay pipes found in Shakespeare's garden contain traces of cannabis, and some scholars believe his writing contains subtle hints about its effects.
So, to be or not to be, high.
Perhaps. It's a fun thought experiment and a reminder that cannabis has been interwoven with human creativity and curiosity for centuries.
From ancient medicines to modern controversies, it's clear this plant has left its mark on history.
And as we continue to unravel its complexities, one can only imagine what the future holds.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it? If cannabis has been around for thousands of years, influencing cultures and societies in ways we're only beginning to understand, where do we go from here?
That's what I find so fascinating about this entire topic. We're in the middle of a global shift in how we perceive and interact with this ancient plant. As legalization spreads and research advances, who knows what we might uncover?
It's exciting to think about. Imagine a world where cannabis-derived medications are commonplace, offering new hope for people suffering from chronic pain, mental health conditions, and even those struggling with addiction.
And beyond the medical applications, think about the environmental implications. A future where sustainable hemp products become the norm, replacing harmful materials and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels.
It seems like we've only scratched the surface of what this plant is capable of.
And that's the beauty of scientific exploration, isn't it? The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
So what does all of this mean for you, dear listener?
It means you're now equipped with a deeper understanding of one of the most fascinating and controversial plants on Earth. You can challenge those long-held assumptions, engage in more informed conversations, and make conscious decisions about whether cannabis has a place in your own life.
And if this deep dive has ignited your curiosity, don't let the learning stop here. Keep asking questions, seek out diverse perspectives, and always be open to new information.
Because who knows what groundbreaking discoveries await us in the ever-evolving story of cannabis. It's a story that's been unfolding for millennia, and we're fortunate enough to witness this chapter unfold.
What a thought. It's been quite a journey exploring all these cannabis facts and stories with you. Until next time, stay curious.